After we have changed data structure to represent activities, in console we got several warnings related to validation. So in this lesson we're gonna get to fixing those warnings. And the first warning is related to base select component. Let's select this component in Vue DevTools. And if before every activity ID was represented by number, right now activity IDs are strings. So in order to fix this validation warning, we need to open up a function which is responsible to validate activity select options, which is this function validate select options. So let's see its definition. In here, this function calls another validator function isSelectOptionValid, which checks two fields, label and value of every activity select option object. Value variable here stores identifier of activity select option. So if before those identifiers were numbers, which is why we were using isNumber function to validate this value, but now identifiers are strings, let's use another function isNotEmptyString. So activity identifier should be either number or non-empty string. And just like that, we have fixed previous validation warning, but now we get another warning. And this warning is related to activities prop of the activities component. And here we basically have the same problem. And to fix it, we need to open up the activities component, find validation rule which validates activities property. And within this validation function, validate activities, we're calling another function isActivityValid. And since before all activities were just represented by simple strings, right now instead of activity name, this function accepts an object with three properties. So every activity object consists of three properties, ID, name, and seconds to complete. We can destructure those properties in here. And then we need to manually apply validation to every property. So to validate identifier, we're gonna use isNotEmptyString function. For property name, we can use the same validation, isNotEmptyString. And finally, seconds to complete property should be a number, so we can check it by using isNumber function. And in order for activity object to be valid, all these three validations should pass. And we can check it like so. Let's wrap these three function calls within an array. And then if all these function calls will return true, it will mean that all validation rules were passed. And to verify that every item in this array is true, we can by using every method and by passing boolean constructor into this method. And this way we have fixed previous validation warning. Let's go to the next one. This one is related to activity item component, specifically to activity property. This is because previously this property were accepting string values, but now we need to modify definition of this property inside of activity item component and change property type on object. So we simply go inside of activity item component, and in here, instead of a string, we're gonna use object. And eventually we'll end up with an empty console, so all validation warnings were successfully fixed. But now just to make sure, let's go back to functions.js file and make it so that one of these validation rules will fail. For example, let's specify a wrong data type for seconds to complete property of an activity object. So in the function which generates activity objects, which is this generateActivities function, let's change value for seconds to complete property and use string. And just like we expected, we got validation warning saying that custom validation check failed for prop activities. So that means our current validation rules protect us from wrong data types passed into component props. And finally in the browser, let's try to remove all activities, then add a couple of new ones. And in this case, we see that we still get some validation warnings. So this warning pops up after we send activity creation form within the activity form component. And specifically whenever we send a submit event to parent component, because this data that we sent along with this event is still a string. But since at our current stage of project development every activity is represented by an object, we're gonna have to change a bit activity creation process, which we will do in upcoming lessons.